Croeso, welcome to our session in the series Lockdown of conversations with our Charles Wallace India Trust Fellows. I'm Alexandra Büchler, and I have the pleasure to introduce V. Ramaswamy, who was our first fellow when we launched the fellowship in 2016. The fellowship is unique in combining writing and translation. The focus is always on translation, but we like to give the opportunity to spend 3 months in the UK, in Wales, to translators who also write and writers who also translate. So the project is a combined one, and when Rama, as we call him, was with us, he focused on translating a Bengali author. But why we selected him was that he had been translating the really quite amazing Subimal Misra. I came across Mishra's books in India before I met Rama, and I was really very impressed with him as a writer. So we were pleased when Rama became our first fellow, and we are proud to have contributed to his work. He is a writer, non-fiction writer and translator based in Kolkata. Since 2005, he has been translating Subimal Misra, who is often described as anti-establishment writer. Ramaswamy translated so far 3 of his books, 2 collections of stories, which again are presented as anti-stories. And the titles are The Golden Gandhi Statue from America and Wild Animals Prohibited, Stories, Anti-Stories. This was followed by This Could Have Been, or this could have become Ramayan Chamar's Tale, 2 anti-novels. All these books were published in India by HarperCollins, and they will be also published by Open Letter, that is Wild Animals Prohibited, and This Could Have Become Ramayan Chamar's Tale. This last book is coming out in July, so less than a month away, and this means that this author, his books will be taken to readers beyond India, and we will talk about this later. When V. Ramaswamy was with us in Wales, he was working on another Bengali author, Manoranjan Byapari, and he was specifically working on the novel Chandal Jibon, which is a story of a boy born into the untouchable Chandal community in East Bengal, whose parents flee from East Pakistan and arrive as refugees in India. Rama, your day-to-day life could not be further from literature and translation. You run a family business. It's a factory that produces instruments. It's called flow meter, and it's also, as I understand, used in medicine, in medical equipment. So it became quite important now with the pandemic. And you also, in the 90s, you were an activist, and you set up a community organization which advocated for the rights of the dispossessed, of the poorest city dwellers in Kolkata. And you then passed on this organization to others to dedicate yourself to translation. You started translating Subimal Misra in around 2000, and you published, or was it later? I think it was later. But do tell us, first of all, how you became a translator.
Right. Thank you for the introduction, Alexandra. I'm very happy to be here. You could call me an accidental translator because it just happened by chance. I met a friend in a bar and I asked him what's happening in Bengali literature these days. And then he said, nothing at all. It's all rubbish. It's unreadable. So I told him, come on, you've got to be kidding. There must be at least one author who's worth talking about. So he pondered for a while and then he said, yes, there is an author. His name is Subimal Misra. And so this was in a bar. So I just said with the usual bonhomie, okay, I'll translate him. And that would have just remained as that. But he kept after me and kept prodding me, when are you going to begin? And then he gave me the author's phone number. And then I called the author and bought his books. And they lay on my desk for 2 months. And then one afternoon I was feeling bored and restless. So I picked it up and started reading and then started translating. And that is how it began. But I guess something was cooking inside me, this kind of engagement with the language and the Bengali society and culture had already been taking place for long, for at least 20 years. And but now looking in hindsight, I can see how much I have grown while translating and gotten deeper into the society and culture and language and realize how little I knew then and how little one always knows, and you have to keep growing. So accidental, but it was cooking perhaps, and then it has led to the most fortuitous and serendipitous outcomes, in terms of growth and learning, and discovery, and so on.
Well, we can only be pleased that all this happened, but it is quite unusual. You as I said, you ran a family business, you studied accountancy, well, let's say it's lucky that you met your friend in the bar and he pointed out this author to you. It usually doesn't happen like this. So now Subimal Misra really allows only you to translate him. He's a very reclusive author. In the introduction, and the title of the session is actually translating iconic Bengali authors. Now, Misra is often described as anarchic, as iconoclastic, anti-establishment. What drew you to this author? Why did you think that he needed to be translated, and others who don't read Bengali?
Right. You're right. He is iconoclastic. There's one word to describe him by, that would be iconoclastic. I mean, nothing is sacrosanct for him. Even himself and his own work, he keeps tearing to shreds, But iconic in the sense that icon means a symbol. So he is a symbol of the very term anti-establishment in Bengal, that is both in West Bengal in India and in Bangladesh. If you went to the literary circle among people who are well-read and so on, and then asked them, could you name one anti-establishment writer? And those who know would say Subimal Misra. There's only one man like him. And not just the content of his writing, but also his whole writing practice. He shunned the mainstream publishing world and publications and published his books himself, designed them himself, made the covers himself, and stored the books in his own warehouse and went to the Calcutta Book Fair and sold them to customers who would come specifically to meet him. And he would not sell it to the person if he didn't want to. He would conduct a quick interview of the person and then judge whether he was capable of reading his work. And there is no price to any of his books. There's a suggested exchange value or what you think you should pay for a book by Subimal Misra. And he continued this for 40 years, And then he stopped writing because of poor health and poor eyesight. But he stuck to that practice. And he set up those rules or principles for himself at the very beginning of his career. Just before he started writing, Jean-Paul Sartre got the Nobel Prize and he spurned it. So that was a very inspiring moment for Misra. He said, yes, that is what true independence as a writer is. You don't bow down before any power, and you don't write for any fame or awards, but you write because you must write. But all this I discovered subsequently. I translated Subimal Misra just because my friend Mrinal Bose mentioned his name to me and I took it on trust. And then after I started reading and translating, then I could see all kinds of resonances with my own life. Misra often writes about the underdog and about the powerless in society and documents their forms of injustice and denial, even in language, the words and terms by which they are referred to and so on. So my life also for many years has been about the underdog in Calcutta, the squatters, the slum dwellers, Muslim slum dwellers in particular, who are among the worst off in terms of housing facilities, economic conditions, education. So that is one example of a resonance, but there were more. This whole anti-establishment stance, of being angry all the time and looking critically all around you, and especially at people's behavior and people's psyche and so on. So once I started translating, having taken Mrinal's suggestion in good faith, I got deeper, and you could say I became more intrinsically linked to the author, and going deeper and deeper. And yes, of course, I did realize that an author like him needs to be known about, needs to be read by people outside the Bengali language, and that he's not just another writer, he's a writer's writer, and he's somebody who deserves a place in the world of literature, in world literature. And there is no world literature without translation. So it is the translator's duty to find and translate such writers. So I took upon myself, his short fiction is more accessible to the non-Bengali reader. The longer fiction would be more daunting because it's so much about Bengali language, Bengali culture, Bengali literature. There's so many allusions and so on. So short fiction is more accessible. So I thought I will translate a selection of his short fiction from the beginning of his career till the end of his career, making a selection. So the first two books have done that, and the final book, which is in process, that takes his writing from the 1990s and 2000s, two decades from which I have selected about 23 stories. And each book, as I was working on, I would think this book is like no other book. And then after the first one came out, I thought the second one is very different from the first. The third book, Ramayana Chamar, is also very different from the earlier two. This one is, again, at another level. And that HarperCollins has taken this on entirely as their project with zest, and especially since the last book, Ramayana Chamar. The same editor hopefully will be working on the final book. So it is as much their project as it is mine. So they're taking a big leap. This is not the kind of book that sells in millions and so on. It's not going to become a bestseller. But it's a critical reader's book which should remain on book lists, and it will keep selling in small quantities over the years, So I'm very pleased about that. So, and I'm being able to do this entirely because HarperCollins came on board. Otherwise, for a writer or a translator to find a good publisher, and the publisher to carry on encouraging that writer and translator. It's rare, I think.
Well, it's a remarkable background story, starting with the way the author actually ignored mainstream publishing. There's something incredibly consistent about how he lives his life, and also the writing, as you said, the themes resonate with your own concerns and concerns of many others, and he also writes about writing. Stylistically, he is a very interesting author. What were his influences, if any? Is that something you have discussed with him?
Yes, over the years, and also what has been written about Subimal Misra, and then the interviews he has given. So I was studying all of that while working on the translation, just to educate myself. So, as I said earlier, after Sartre turned down the Nobel Prize, so this independence of the writer and detachment from any commercial or market or establishment links, that inspired him. Also, he was a very voracious reader from his childhood in Bangla, but including the classics like War and Peace and so on. So early in life, when he was about to become a writer, he thought that enough has been done in the narrative tradition by people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Thomas Mann and French
great classics.
a French man writing a remembrance, Proust. So he thought that after such masters, all that others can do is more of the same. But that the highest points of that medium, the narrative medium novel, has already been attained, and that was his view. So he thought, but I want to write. So if I write at all, it must be different. It must not follow that old tradition. In fact, it will give that up entirely. It will disavow it entirely. That is why his stories came to be known as anti-stories. Everything that you expect there to be in a story is not there. There's no character, there's no plot, there's no linear sequence of events, nothing. It's just a medium he uses to do something. And plus, he was very influenced by the cinematic medium, and especially the works of Sergei Eisenstein and later Jean-Luc Godard. And one of I think the first book I brought out, Golden Gandhi statue, that has an epigraph dedication to Jean-Luc Godard, who taught me language. So language meaning the language of Godard's cinema, where according to Misra, the film was a kind of argument, a political argument. So he thought he wanted to do that. He wanted to write, and what he was writing was a film, as if you were watching a film instead of reading it. So often the text is descriptions of the scene. Sometimes even the camera is placed here, and then the light enters from there, and what effect it has on the reader's psyche. He discusses that while actually dealing with that. So, and in Bengali, we call films books. The word for film is chobi, and the word for books is boi. So usually people refer to films as boi. Which boi did you watch today? Because films used to be made on books, on great novels and so on. So that attachment came about. So while Bengalis refer to films as books, Misra calls his stories films. And that's what he's doing. He's a filmmaker using text. And so he was very influenced by cinema. And then he discovered the work of the American, what's his name? The cut technique, cut out, naked lunch. William Burroughs. William Burroughs cut up and cut out and cut technique he found very attracting, and he embraced it entirely and made it his own. So the stage I am now at, now I can recognize, but when I was beginning my work, I would be completely, at a loss. I mean, what is this? Why does this come up? Why is he doing this? But that has become his signature style. In the middle of saying something, suddenly a few sentences appear out of the blue. And then it recurs. What happens in those few sentences advances a little bit when it comes next, 2 pages later. So he takes the liberty to do all kinds of things. But eventually, all of these inspirational sources he distilled within himself. Also, several Bengali writers from the early 20th century. There was a writer called Jagadish Gupta, slightly junior to Tagore, and who could be said to be one of the early anti-establishment writers in the Bengali language. Then somebody a bit older than Misra called Kamal Kumar Majumdar. Then another writer called Omyo Bhushan Majumdar in Bengali. Then somebody who wrote about the downtrodden folk. There's a famous novel called Dharai Chorit Manas, which is a kind of saga of the downtrodden. So there have been all those influences in him. And in the last book that I brought out, Ramayan Chamar, there is a piece by Subimal Misra himself about the anti-novel, where he discusses some of these influences. But that he tried to cross and go beyond all of those and come out with something of his own, looking at the society around him. And if you read Ramayan Chamar, it's very spontaneous. So maybe he sets a daily routine of sitting down at 11 a.m. and writing. And all that he can write this morning at 11 a.m. is, I heard the slippers of the servant last night. There's nothing more that he can say. So, and the sound that those slippers make on the stairs, that's what he wrote for that day's input. And then in other parts, he gets very deep into something and so on. And he uses newspaper clippings, news stories, which he retells in his own way, makes a collage of all of these elements. So it is a bit arcane. Not everybody would take to it, but some people like it very much. And I was also very fortunate to have a close friend who took an interest in my translation and loved it. And then I came to realize that he is the imagined reader that Subimal Misra is writing for. So I wrote an essay, what I had to write in Aberystwyth, I wrote later in Bangla 2 years later. So there I say that a writer is like an archer. He lets go of the arrow and he knows a particular target, and that's where he's shooting at. So in this case, my friend Janam Mukherjee, he's a historian, he was the intended target. So he would read my translations and explain to me what the author is saying. So that was a wonderful relationship. He needs my translation and I need his explanation. It reminded me of the great Russian masters in Western classical music. Those people, Borodin, Glinka, Rimsky-Korsakov, and so on. Their lives were deeply intertwined. Somebody died, somebody else completed his work, some they exchanged lovers and mistresses and so on. So rather like that, Janam and I are together on this Subimal Misra project. And so he's my first reader now, and I ask for his critical comments.
But thematically, his work can be quite harrowing for the reader. I mean, there is a lot of violence, and at the same time, it brings up the somehow indifference, or exposes the indifference of society towards the abuses of the lowest strata of the population. I found that personally quite difficult.
Very dark and harrowing,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, but he's definitely an author worth reading, and I always recommend him to anyone who is asking, you know, what can I read that has been written in Indian languages. Let's now look at the other author you have been working on. This was the translation you were working on when you were with us in Wales. And I remember you coming into the office every day, writing in longhand and, you know, in the middle of the kind of hustle and bustle of the office and people chatting and so on. So I'll never forget that. That image of you, and I remember we gave you a small office for yourself, and you didn't like it. You came to sit with us. So I also feel that somehow, you know, that environment has somehow contributed to you know, to your work and to the translation. But it's a long novel, so you translated part of it and then you continued when you went back. Tell us about this author. Again, what drew you to him, and what are maybe the commonalities and differences between Byapari and Misra?
Right. You know, I applied for the Charles Wallace Fellowship must have been in April of 2016. And in the months before that, I had made contact with Manoranjan Byapari. After hearing about him and hearing about his autobiography, which had been awarded a prize by the Literature Academy here in Kolkata. So, and then I wanted to translate his autobiography, and he said somebody is already doing that. And then he gave me this long novel, Chandal Jivan. In fact, his autobiography is a kind of summarized version of this novel, Chandal Jivan. And Chandal Jivan was written before the autobiography was written. And it was published in limited numbers in Bengali. And he gave it to me, and I applied to Charles Wallace Fellowship, and I got it, and I started the translation there. What he gave me were actually 2 volumes. I didn't know that at that moment. And then when I had completed translating those 2 volumes, he told me there is 1 more volume, but I haven't started that. So finally now that is going to be brought out by Amazon Westland, and they will bring it out in 3 volumes. And the first volume might come out this year. So I'm just giving a final reading to the manuscript before sending it off to them. So, and then the second volume is about 60% complete. I have to go over it once again, which I will do in the immediate following period. And then the third volume I have to translate from scratch. So, and the 3 will come out. Each volume will have a subtitle, but maybe the first volume will have the subtitle Chandal Jivan, because it's a proper noun. Chandal is the name of a community, like Apache or something. And Jivan is a name, it means life in Bangla. So Chandal Jivan, the runaway boy, because he runs away from home early in the novel. And the novel ends with him returning home. So now, why Manoranjan Byapari? Subimal Misra and Manoranjan Byapari are poles apart in every way, you know. Subimal Misra, though from a rather impoverished background, but he belongs to the Brahmin caste, and his father was a Sanskrit priest and scholar, the traditional Sanskritic life. So culturally and socially, he is at the top of the heap, and Manoranjan Byapari belongs to a Chandal family, or the Namasudra family. They are so-called untouchable before untouchability was banned in India, but it exists for all practical purposes. So Subimal Misra has a master's degree in Bengali. Manoranjan Byapari never went to school and only learned to read and write when he was in prison in his early 20s for some street violence or something. And a sympathetic jail warden took an interest in him and encouraged him to read and write. So, and then he read as much as he could, but it also occurred to me that when you're a writer, there's a socialization that has taken place leading to your writing, and you've been schooled in various ways, formally and informally. So there's all kinds of received things in you which form you as a writer, or you may choose to depart from all that. But this man is unlike any other writer because he has no formal education. He's not studied literature. Anything that he's read is entirely by random. So, and he's coming from a section of the society for whom daily survival and life can be quite harrowing. And that is basically the subject matter of his writing, the lives of the oppressed. In that sense, there is a similarity with Subimal Misra. He's also looking at the downtrodden. But Subimal Misra is a non-conventional writer. Manoranjan Byapari is not doing anything in terms of style or form or anything. It's all about the content of what he is saying, stories, who the stories are about, how the plot moves and how it ends, and the irony and the satire and the bitterness and the rage and the violence that is all there in the course of the story. So a bit of a similarity, but a huge difference. But since I had been translating Subimal Misra, I thought if I translate some other writer, that should be with some thought and sound judgment. Because there's so many writers, whom should I translate? But that self-taught man, I think there's a word in English for that called autodidact.
Mm.
That man coming from a very oppressed background, himself lived a very difficult, harsh life, and taught himself to read and write, and then wrote and won a leading prize of the Bengali Academy. That itself is a tale, you know. And this is his autobiography, not an autobiography, it is an autobiographical novel, and he told me that that was his most heartfelt work in his life, that novel. So that is why I proposed to translate it. And when I was in Wales, I translated 170,000 words in 3 months. And the remaining 50,000 words of those 2 books, it took me 8 more months to translate that. And then I took a break, and then I spent 4 months completing the first volume. So that's done. The second volume, as I said, is about 60% done. So, you know, when I translate, I read from the Bangla and I translate into English, and at great speed. I'm trying to tell myself that there is no need for speed at all. There can't be speed in translation, but there's an impatience. And so anything that is not easy to do at speed, I leave. I just put parentheses there, check the original, and move on. So there are a lot of those blanks in my first round translation. Sometimes if the syntax rendering it into English is difficult, I just don't even put syntax. I just put words in the order in which they appear in Bengali, without any grammatical sense. Once it's all typed in, then you can fiddle around with the words and fill in the blanks and so on. So that second round of completion is left for the second volume. And I also translated some short stories of Byapari. They've been published in various places. Recently, it was published in this journal called Metamorphoses. That's published in five colleges in Massachusetts bring out this journal. It's a journal of literary translation. So they brought out a Byapari story, and I interrupted my Subimal Misra project to take up Byapari, and now I am back at work on the Subimal Misra project for the final volume. So I'm a bit distant from Byapari now. I have to pick it up again to submit to the publisher. But whatever I had to invest in it has been done. Those 3 months in Wales, it couldn't have happened unless I was there. That chunk of time, and as you said, every day just sitting from morning to evening, 8 hours in running hand, a huge amount of work, 170,000 words. So be sure that when the book comes out, the credit and the acknowledgement.
Well, we are honored and to have contributed to this
Frontiers, and Charles Wallace will be there.
And I have another question. We will have to soon draw this to an end to allow enough time for the Q&A that will come later. But tell me about the kind of linguistic background to all this. It's been pointed out that you are Tamil. Like every Indian, you speak several languages. I assume you speak Tamil. You have mastered Bengali to the point where you can translate into English, another one of your languages, and I suppose you speak Hindi as well. Are there other Indian languages you can speak?
Tamil, Bangla, Hindi, and Urdu.
Urdu as well. So
I worked in this Urdu Muslim community in Howrah for several years, and so picked up that language.
How did you master Bengali? You grew up in Kolkata, or because
yes.
you have mastered it, you in all its layers, the literary language, the street slang, you have kind of covered that whole scope. Tell me about your relationship with the language.
I lived in Calcutta all my life. And I went to school away from Calcutta for 5 years and then returned. But I was in a kind of bubble of my class and ethnic community, Tamil, upper caste Tamil community in Calcutta. You were in a cocoon. And then one started going out of that cocoon from my university days. And then when I returned to India in 1984, after a brief stint of accountancy in England, then very much I immersed myself into the local Bengali political and activist world, and learned everything from that. I had rudimentary education in the Bengali language for about 3 years in primary school, and then I left Calcutta. So I had no formal education in the Bengali language after that. And though I could read and write if I had to save my life, but I never read or wrote, except in case of some emergency. If I have to look for a street sign and it's in Bangla, I can read it. But I was entirely not in the Bengali reading world, and my life wasn't that way. But my work as a grassroots activist and community organizer required me to be proficient in the language, to be able to say what I wanted to say and to be able to understand what people are saying. And I became a kind of barefoot sociologist of my city, and as you said, layers. So you understand this man speaks like that man speaks like that. Their accents differ, their vocabulary differs. The linguistic universe of this man is different from the linguistic universe of this man. And you try and see where that comes from. Why do they speak different? How does an educated man speak? How does a literate man speak? How does a writer speak? How does a teacher speak? How does a street hawker speak? How does a ruffian on the street speak? So I was imbibing all this, inherently. And all of that helped. So the moment I decided to translate, all of this came to play. So my relationship to the Bengali language is entirely by ear. I learned the language by ear, by hearing it being spoken. And when I was in college and university, the television, early days of Indian television, you had a brief program every 3 hours of transmission from Calcutta. And every weekend there was a Bengali film. So in the 4 or 5 years that I spent in Calcutta, then I must have seen each and every Bengali film that they screened. So apart from making me a kind of encyclopedia of Bengali cinema of an era, but it also taught me the language. In fact, I think just like you begin a child's alphabet teaching by saying A for apple, B for bat, and so on. So my Bengali language learning began with a sign that they used to put up. It was all very crude and so on. So when there was some breakdown in transmission or interruption or something, they would have a cardboard cutout on the black and white TV saying, sorry for the interruption. But in Bengali, Onushthan Prochare Bigno Ghotaye Dukkhito, or we regret the interruption in the broadcast. Bigno Ghotaye, meaning for the interruption. But the word Bigno is from Sanskrit, and it is related to one of the names of the god Ganesh. Ganesh is the lord of interruptions or the lord of beginnings. Whenever you start anything, you invoke Ganesh so that your work will go smoothly. There'll be no interruption. Wi-Fi won't go, computer won't malfunction. So his name is Vignesh. Vignesh and Bigno. So it was a very auspicious cutout saying, let's take the name of Ganesha, and that's why my Bengali learning proceeded well. But another thing is, as I said, I learned the Bengali language by ear. So my translation work is not so much about literature, though I am a man of literature in terms of having read literature from my childhood. And so though I'm a manufacturer and a grassroots activist or whatever, what made it easy for me to become a translator was I am in the world of literature, immersed in it. All the great writers of contemporary era like Marquez and so on. Like anybody else, I'm swimming in that same ocean. So, but though I'm a man of literature, but in my translation, I'm a man of language. I'm simply conveying the Bengali language into English, that is all. Like a ferryman, I'm ferrying across the language. Though in Subimal Misra's case, it becomes more difficult because his writing is all about language. There's no story, there's no plot, there's no murder, there's no action, nothing. So the whole accent is on language. He's playing with the language, he's subverting the language, he's examining the language. A lot of that is difficult to translate, but still.
And you work quite closely with him, don't you, with the author?
Now, since 2014, he's completely bedridden, and he can't speak much. He has to make an effort to speak. It's difficult for him to speak, but he can hear and listen. But until about 2013, I think, I was actively discussing with him, mostly by phone. Once before Wild Animals came out, before the final manuscript was sent, he gave me a long commentary on one of the stories. He said it's one of his favorite stories, and who he was influenced by and what he was trying to do and all that. So, but mostly I was working on my own. I didn't presume that I can just at the drop of a hat consult him. So I left that for the very least amount of intervention by him. Anything he would say, anything I said or shared with him, if he responded, I would take it on board. But I don't think I ever made a list of questions and asked him, okay, I want to ask you this and this. One time, one story of his that I found out was very important. I translated it, and then I picked him up from his apartment and took him to a cafe that was run by a friend. And we sat and I read out my translation, and then he gave a commentary. And then I realized it's not possible to be fair to what he wanted. So I left that out of the list. But I worked a lot on it. You know, he made things like the sentences should be dreamy and not logical. You should ingest Eluard and then try and write like that. So that is a project of a lifetime, you know. So he said, read Lorca, read Eluard, and so on. And I'm not a poet myself, so or a reader of poetry. So I left that. But I think that was the closest to any shoulder-to-shoulder collaboration. But long phone calls, and now I don't like to make phone calls, and he also can't talk very much, so that has stopped. And he's a fiercely independent man and reclusive man, and he doesn't want to be obliged to anybody under the sun. He'd rather suffer in silence than call anybody for help. So he was a bit distant. He was cordial and courteous and friendly and warm even, but always a bit distant. And in fact, the first book, just before it came out, he became enraged with me because the blurb about the author that he wrote, I had edited it a little bit, and then he abused me. He said, you can't do stuff like that. You know, I'm a decent person. You can't take advantage of me. And he fired me left and right over the phone. And I was so dejected, I thought, okay, that's the end of that project, and I don't care. And then the same friend who mentioned his name first to me, Mrinal, I phoned him and lamented about the whole thing. So he then called the author and said, you did a very wrong thing. You shouldn't have scolded him like that, and so on. And so via Mrinal, he apologized to me. And then the project resumed and the book came out. And the following year, his mother died. And just after his mother died, I was there to help him get the hearse. And I couldn't attend the cremation because of something else, but I arranged for the money and for the taxi and the vehicle and the hearse and all that. And he was very close to his mother. So since his mother's demise, he opened himself completely to me like a child. And there's no separation or distance or anything. Yes, when some friends, other friends visit him, he grumbles and complains that he hasn't seen me for a long time and so on. Sometimes he said, oh, he's wandering around in Italy and Germany, but he has no time to see me. And then I laugh about that, you know, because he's forgotten that I visited him 2 weeks ago. You know?
Well, I suppose there are readers of his work you can also talk to and discuss your translation, but
yes, very much.
kind of relationship with an author can be very precious and sometimes, you know, quite strained and so on. So thank you for talking about this. I suppose one day maybe you will write a memoir of, you know, a translator of these two authors. Let's see. We have to stop here, Rama. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and we will continue with the Q&A. And thanks a lot again. It was really wonderful to see you, and I'm so grateful to this technology that makes it possible for us to do this.
Fabulous.
So, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Alexa.
So welcome everyone to the second part of this session, the Q&A part. As you can see, both Rama and I look different, and this is because we pre-recorded the conversation and now we're going live. I would like to introduce my colleague Ellen, Professor Ellen Huff-Griffith-Jones, who is at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and who also was in that office that Rama used to come to. So we are here as three people who have known each other for now 4 years, and Ellen will be co-moderating the Q&A, which will be shorter than usual because Rama is such a narrator that I just didn't want to stop him, and we completely ran over when we were doing the pre-recorded session. So I think we have some questions here, and the first question was from Vinuta. Hello, Vinuta. I'm sorry we can't have you on screen. It would be lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. The question is about the expectations of the authors of the translated books. I'm not sure whether this is expectations of the actual translation and whether you discuss it or the reception, but Rama, what would you respond to this question? Can you tell us about the expectations of the authors when it comes?
Yeah, speaking about Subimal Misra, yes, he's an author with a conceit in the positive sense of that word. And so there is an inherent wish, I'm sure, within him to be able to reach readers across barriers of language. And those who've read him and have written about his writing have commented, for instance, that a writer like him, one would have expected him to be in the curriculum of students of experimental literature and so on. People may have been doing PhD theses on his writing, but he's largely unknown. So yes, I would like to think he's very delighted and happy about the translation. And I report to him as much as possible what I've translated, where it's appeared, where it's being republished, how it's being translated into another language. So obviously, he's a writer whose time has come and whose name is waiting to be known around the world, and translation is key. The same for Byapari as well, and especially since he comes from an extremely marginalized background, where such voices from the margins are necessarily stifled and silenced. And the little that he has read, which has inspired him, writing by other people in his situation, like there's a famous novel or autobiography in Hindi called Jhutan by a writer called Om Prakash Valmiki in Hindi. It's complicated to explain the word Jhutan. It's about you can't touch, you can't eat together. So if I eat something, what I have eaten or my soiled plate is untouchable for a person of the higher caste. So it's an autobiography of an untouchable man. So such things have inspired Byapari, and those works have been translated and been recognized and led to a genre called Dalit writing and Dalit biographies and Dalit autobiographies. So Byapari was very much writing in that form and in that genre. So he would also implicitly be hoping to be translated and translated well. So yes, I'm sure both the authors are keen about being known about in the wider reading world through translation.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you. Ellen, I think you wanted to ask a question, did you?
Yeah, I was in the conversation, which I enjoyed the conversation immensely, and I was thinking, about Misra and about his, his clear activism and his engagement, and thinking that he also belonged possibly to a period, to a generation of activists, of activism, as well as writers, maybe not necessarily in the same Bengali tradition, but clearly, a generational possibly engagement there. And I was thinking, what was the reception and what continues to be the reception to his work? Is it is it writing that resonates across generations? And in particular, what are younger generations today thinking of his writing in the original Bengali, but also perhaps through your translations as well?
Thanks, Ellen. Let's see. Just before Misra started writing, a major explosion took place in the Bengali literary world. You had a literary movement called the Hungryalists, or the Hungry generation. Hungry realism, realism about hunger. So they were called the Hungryalists in the early 60s. And in the late 60s, there was a political explosion in Bengal with something called the Naxalite uprising. These were Maoist, Leninist revolutionaries. And so one writer had commented that what the revolutionaries did in the political plane had actually been anticipated by the young poets of the hungry generation in the literature plane. They just wanted to turn everything upside down. So Misra entered writing just after that hungry generation and on the cusp of the Maoist-Leninist revolution. So, in a sense, the space had been created for him politically and in literary terms to do what he wanted to do. But that was a long time ago. That was in the late 60s. The interesting thing is he sustained that practice for 40, 45 years, and kept that particular candle alight over those years. And therefore his name was there for subsequent generations also to know. And so the readership of Misra has kept growing across generations. Every new generation discovers him. And then there have been writers who have been clearly influenced by him. Somebody who reads the work of a writer called Nabarun Bhattacharya. He's the son of the great Bengali writer Mahashweta Devi, and himself a path-breaking anti-establishment writer. So I hadn't read anything by Nabarun, but somebody who was helping me in my translation. I shared Subimal Misra's writings with her, and she said, now I can see where he's coming from. But for Subimal, you couldn't have had a Nabarun. And now you have generations growing up reading Nabarun and being inspired by that. And through him, they will get to know about Misra because he laid the ground for that. That whole thing after the Obama election, she did this and then he did this so he could walk and he could get on the bus. and so on, tracing the whole path of the Black people's efforts over centuries. So in underground literature, in anti-establishment literature, there's this stream. So people keep joining that stream and learning about forebearers in that stream. And the translation helps that also.
I don't know if I could just ask you another, because it's again focusing on Misra's work, and in your introduction to or in your notes on Wild Animals Prohibited, you say, with regard to the treatment of women, you say only in the Bengali original would the full context and nuance of each word be accessible. Can you say a little bit more about that, about his treatment or the treatment of women in his stories, and the challenges for you as a translator of that?
Yes, difficult question. Though Misra is a man, I like to think that he has allied himself to every struggle of people across the globe and in our country. And so women are at the forefront. Some of the most notable and heroic little cameos that he portrays in his writing are of women, little bits of speech by an oppressed woman or a woman in great distress. To a Bengali reader, immediately convey the deep empathy with which he is writing that. And then the scorn or anger with which he represents the way women are treated in society, the words by which they are referred to, and so on, which are deeply abusive words and sexually abusive words. You know, in Bengali, there are some common terms used to refer to women like whore and slut and things like that, which have become part of the vocabulary which people use unthinkingly. So he holds a mirror to that. And we talk nowadays about intersectionality, you know, the issues of class and gender and race all coming together. He has been dealing with that for a long time and trying to put in front of the reader this complex situation of oppression and prejudice and exploitation that we all live within.
Unmute, Alexandra, you unmute.
Keep doing this. Okay, here I am. Thank you. You said, Rama, that as a man, you're a man of literature. As a translator, you're a man of language. And I had a question in my mind about that, but we have a question here from one of the attendees here, Hemang Desai, who is asking, what is Byapari's language like in the original? Does he use a dialect of Bengali? If yes, how do you bring the syntax and semantic structures specific to Dalit life into English?
Yeah, many thanks to Hemang for raising that. In my translation practice, that is the key challenge that I have not been able to resolve. Byapari is the work that I translated. A good part of it is in the East Bengali dialect. And so when you read the original, as an modern urban reader, if I was a Bengali reader, so I'm not just reading, the language and the dialogue itself is saying various things. So somebody is speaking in the high language. Somebody is speaking in the common language. Somebody is speaking in a dialect. So there is a sociology involved here. The reader implicitly knows this man is a rich guy. This man is an educated guy. this man is a laborer, and so on. So those nuances are lost in translation. I cannot do anything with dialect except just translate it into English in terms of what it means. And if I try to give it a certain other flavor or form, it is synthetic. It doesn't exist. I'm creating it. Whereas the original East Bengali dialect exists, just like Cockney exists, or the Geordie dialect exists in Northern England, or the Scottish dialect exists, and then the larger Scottish language. So, whereas it exists in the original and my translation is synthetic, so I prefer not to do anything. I just prefer to convey the meaning in English with some mention that he was speaking in that dialect and so on. So for me as a translator, dialect is my Waterloo. I haven't worked out how to deal with it.
I think translating dialect is one of the most difficult things. It's something that's discussed. Nobody's quite sure about how to do it because it's almost impossible to pick a dialect in the target language and turn it into an equivalent. It's impossible. So it is a challenge to be translating anything written in a dialect. My question related to this is how do you deal with cultural references? You said you were a translator of language, and but still there is a whole context that you have to convey in a language where the context may be understood by people who speak that language as their second or even first language in India, but not elsewhere. So how do you deal with that?
When I translate, I imagine that I am translating for someone who knows Bengali but is reading it in English. That's the first level. Second is somebody who is an Indian and who speaks one or more other Indian languages. So there is still a commonality of words and cultural symbols and so on across the Indian languages. And the third is for the person outside India who knows nothing. So early in my translation, I discovered that despite that huge linguistic and cultural barrier, there was something in my translation of Misra that was able to get through to distant foreigners. And so I learned a lot from that and about the power of Misra's writing. So short answer is, I don't address that question as far as possible. So if I'm reading the English translation of a French novel where words like souffle or champagne are used, in the history of the colonial world, colonial subjects are expected to know about such things. A souffle is a souffle, there's no equivalent for it. Or a quiche is a quiche. Similarly, there are Bengali dishes, like chachori and so on, which are part of the global heritage of culinary arts. So they should also start learning about it. So Misra makes the reader work, and as a translator, I allow them to do that work. But yes, one of my books was recently brought out for American publication. So we had to read it closely and give some notes and explanations or change the vocabulary and so on in order to relate to American readers.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So American readers need footnotes. I was actually going to ask about footnotes, but you answered my question. I think this is all we have time for. it's a pity we could go on, but this was a longer session. It's the last one in this short series of 4 discussions, 4 conversations with our Charles Wallace India Trust Fellows. And you will be able to watch them on our Facebook page, or you can also go to our website where we have been uploading them. And it was a real pleasure to speak to you, Rama, today, and also to connect or reconnect with our former fellows. And we will be very soon issuing a call for the next fellowship. So as they say, watch this space. Thank you everyone who attended. Thank you Yr Egin for hosting this session. And last but not least, thank you Ellen for co-hosting the Q&A with me. And thank you to Kari, our colleague who is invisible but indispensable. So once again, thank you all, and those who weren't able to join us now, I hope will watch these sessions online on the Facebook or on our website.